Any questions or comments about any of that? Did I miss something? Do I need to restate it? Okay.
So with the world like it is today in the United States,
It is a great question. So what do we do? I'm repeating it for the podcast. What do we do with storms, hurricanes, earthquakes, famine stuff today if these are not a sign of God that we're sinning? That's a very good question. I have my view on that. I'll be happy to tell you what my view is, but my view doesn't have to be the view. I'll just tell you my reflection on that, if that's okay, since you asked me. So my view is that, one, in the Old Testament, when it says that God sends those things, like in Isaiah, he says, do I not send the storm, and so forth. Some people interpret those to mean, and apply it, to think that it applies at all times, God always sends the storm. So I think it wasn't James Dobson, whoever it was, says that the hurricane of Katrina was to kill all the gays in New Orleans. And all that stuff. I mean, he was very outspoken. Maybe it wasn't who was it? It wasn't Dobson. No, who's the old guy on the Pat Robertson? It was Pat Robertson. Sorry. Pat Robertson. Sorry, my bad. So it was old Pat. Not. Sorry, Dobson. I love you. Pat Robertson, if I recall, said that. Of course, it begs the question: what about all the people who weren't gays that it killed? So God's just sloppy when He kills people, I guess. I mean, it begs questions like that. About his application. Some people do interpret that. I met a guy one time at a previous place, not at a church, but he got very upset when he heard someone even imply that God was not the cause of all the storms. And he went to the Isaiah text and he got very irate about it. And I hear that, and I respect that view. I just don't find it compelling, and I'll tell you why. One is because I think those texts apply to the Old Testament times. I think ancient Jews, when they wrote these narratives, assumed that God was the cause of those things. The question is, were they right in assuming it or not? Well, I go back and forth. Those who have a view of inspiration that says they have to be right, then they were right. God did cause the plague and the storm. Every time there was a plague is because they sinned in their land. If you don't assume inspiration means you have to have it that way, then you're up to grabs. You can say, well, no, maybe they just misunderstood him. Maybe God doesn't send plagues to punish someone. But you make up your own mind how. So that's the first thing I'd say is, I do think it applied to them. That understanding applied to them. Whether or not God really did it that way or not is a separate question. Part B. The second thing, the reason why I don't think it applies to us today, is because if God does it, which He might, if He sends a storm today, it would mean He sends it in such a way that it is profoundly, mysteriously hidden behind what we call laws of nature. So it's so surreptitious and clandestine and behind the scenes, we wouldn't know the difference if we just didn't know God existed. We would think a storm just got formed because heat raised from the earth's crust and mixed with cold air and formed a storm. A Christian might say, no. That's what it looks like on the outside. But really, God caused it. It had nothing to do with heat. And you go, so every time there's a storm in a pattern, it's always because of heat. It's not that. It's because God always caused. That is to say, that cause in meteorology is always the cause of a storm, whatever that cause is. If you think God causes a storm, it means you must mean God always, consistently, 100% of the time causes it. I would find it more compelling if God really is the cause, if sometimes it were not based on those what we call laws of nature. Let's say, for example, right now, there's a sunset, and all of a sudden, right now, it started lightning and a tornado hit us. And a meteorologist would go, man, it's crazy. At least once a week, we have no explanation. It seems like a miracle. Then I'd go, something's going on. 98% of the time, there's a pattern, but 2% of the time, it just, all of a sudden, people die. Come to find out, they're a bunch of sinners. See, I would find that more compelling, but I don't find that. What I find is 100% of the time, people go to school and learn that there are what we call laws of nature, that these things cause these things. So then you might say, well, then David, like I said, God works through that. Well, maybe so. My view is, if God works through those laws of nature, He did it from the beginning of the universe. I think at the beginning of the universe, He designed the universe with certain laws of nature that set into motion the earth to be created when it did. I think the earth is about 6.6 billion years old. I think it's been around for a long time. And I think God clearly, but He certainly knew the earth would be formed the way it is. I do think the moon first came from the earth. I think the thing smashed into it, formed the moon. I don't think God went, wink, wink, or snapped His fingers and smashed the earth. And I think laws of nature cause these things to occur. So if God is the cause of storms, my view is He caused it when He created the universe. He caused it that way. So He caused the earth to be formed and shaped in a universe in which earthquakes are the natural result of the resulting tectonic shifts, that hurricanes are the natural result of rising heat temperatures in the ocean, which gets redistributed. I don't know the cause of everything. Like, why is it that we don't always know the benefit of a tornado? We know why it happens. We know these other things do cause benefits. Nutrients in the earth get redistributed by hurricanes and earthquakes and things like that. There's a, and I write about this in my book. In my book, I give all kinds of examples of benefits to the earth that these things occur. But I don't personally think, so those are my two big issues. My therefore is, I personally don't think God causes storms today. Let me say it in a philosophical way. I don't think God is the personal agent causing the storms that occur or the earthquakes that occur. I don't think he's going up there, okay, they're sending time for an earthquake. I think he set into motion a universe that developed an earth that has these things we call laws of nature. That God sustains. He sustains the laws. They're not independent of God. But I think he did that on purpose. He knew way ahead of time, this is the earth we have. Well, David, could he not have designed an earth like Transformers that's all made of steel and never has to have and we have self-generating trees that fruit never stops producing it? I guess he could have. So then the question is, why did he do it that way? And that's a different issue. But most Christian theologians would say because it's probably not what we call a feasible world, one that can actually be actualized, where the most amount of people freely come to know Jesus. That is to say, I think this is the very best ant farm he could have made that allows free agents to exist and be morally responsible for each other. And that's what he wants, to form character, not have pets. So I don't think so. One, because I think the Bible does not apply to all storms at all time. I think they thought that about what applies to the Jews, at minimum. Two, we find a pattern at work today called meteorology, and that pattern's never broken as far as I know. And I don't think God is hidden behind the heat waves and whatever. I think he's created the universe in such a way these things happen, quote unquote, naturally. But ancient people didn't think much that way. There's not a natural world versus supernatural world. They're just intertwined so much. They don't think God caused everything. They think he was intimately related to everything. That is true, but they did not think. And I'll give you some example here, if I'll keep going. In Jesus says this, right? In Mark, he says, look at the guy who plants the seed, and the plant grows and grows. He sleeps, and when he awakes, it grows and grows, and he does not know how, but it does, and it grows and becomes a huge tree. He doesn't say because God caused the growth. God made it grow. He said he didn't know how. Well, that demonstrates a commonness, an understanding of the ancient world. They don't know how it grows. It just does. There's a lot of things like that demonstrate in the text. They just happen. We don't know how or why it happens, but it does. So they count on it. But if everything was the cause of God, they would always say, and then God did this, and God, but they don't do that every time. Sometimes they do. God must have sent that plague. But I think if I time travel to the 8th century BC and say, hey, I heard there's an earthquake in Assyria. What do you think the cause of that is? I think they would have said, God. I do. I think that's the case. Why them? Well, because they're sinners. The Assyrians are horrible people. They take over people and pillage and rape the women, and clearly, they would say clearly he's punishing them. I mean, yes, they would. I'm just saying, and maybe they were right, and maybe I'm wrong. I just think today that I don't have that theological understanding of God. Now, that's a mouthful. Let me stop there. And what questions or feedback do you have about that?
I'm also thinking of how it says, I think in Revelation, or I don't know where it came from, but how there are more and more of everything.
Yeah, good. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Everything is worse. Everything keeps getting worse.
It's getting worse. Yes, ma'am.
It's the worst it's ever been. It's the strongest it's ever been. It's the, whatever. It's the worst.
Mm-hmm. It kind of says that. That's right. In Revelation, it says that, and the end times there will be. That's right. And when I do Revelation,
it says there will be famines and earthquakes in various places.
That's right.
But that's
you said that's Matthew. Is that Matthew 24?
Yeah, Matthew 24.
Yeah. And Mark 13 and Luke 21. Yeah, Jesus there is.
That's like an end time prophecy.
It is. And when we do Revelation, I'd be happy. In apocalyptic literature, it was commonplace to use natural chaos as a sign that the cosmos are coming unraveled. And it gets worse. They'll say there's famines and droughts, then earthquakes, and then it's famine, it gets bigger and bigger, and then hailstorms or whatever, then this moon gets turned to blood, the sun gets darkened, it gets cosmic in scale. And apocalyptic authors thought that when you can see earthquakes and famines and bears, oh my, they go, oh, that's happened just the other day. Like in AD 79 when Mount Vesuvius erupted. They'll say, I know that happened. They're going to say, ha ha ha, that's their sign that the cosmos is coming unraveled. Well, they haven't seen the sun fall down and the moon turn to blood. That must mean it hasn't happened yet. But that means we're also right on the cusp. So things have already started to unravel, but we're not fully unraveled yet.
Right.
And that's a textbook apocalyptic image of a cosmic unraveling. So in all fairness, if John the Revelator showed up tonight and said, do you think those earthquakes are a sign of sin or God doing it? He might say yes. He might say, David, I don't think so. You're wrong. I think, David, earthquakes are a sign of the end times. He might say that. He might. And I would love to have a conversation with him and say, then help me understand the meteorology thing and help me understand now that we learn more about this and that, why do you think that's the case? I mean, we know for a fact that babies are born with certain, what we call defects, probably are not because they've sinned in the womb or the parents have sinned. It's because chromosomes have, when they've duplicated the DNA strand, something didn't duplicate correctly. Well, I don't think the parents sinned or they're doing, but Jews did think that. Rabbis later on, so when someone was born blind, deaf, or some kind of physical deformity, they would say, why this happened? The rabbi said, it must have been because they sinned in the womb or their parents did. John's gospel demonstrates a narrative where they come up to a blind guy and they say, hey, Jesus, who sinned? This guy or his parents? And Jesus says what? Neither. This is just for the glory of God. This has nothing to do with someone's sin. Again, it's one of several examples like that. In Luke's gospel, Jesus talks about a tower in Solomon that fell down, not because they were sinners, it just the tower fell down. So we have several examples where Jesus doesn't give a theological cause. It's just there for, and it can be redeemed, but we're not told, oh yeah, he's a sinner. So that's why it's those kind of telltale signs.
So you don't think, like, since the fall of man, it's not degenerating the life?
Well, again, that's a great question. Since the fall of man has not degenerated.
Since sin entered in.
I do think sin has entered in. Of course, the Old Testament never calls it a fall, but I hear what you're saying. I'll call it that for your vocabulary.
Yeah.
Since Adam and Eve sinned, has had what I call a meta impact on all things. I do think it had a massive impact. Paul likes to say this in Romans that all creation groans for redemption.
Right.
The average, let me say it differently. Every Christian author I've ever heard who's an apologist or theologian or defender who asks about natural disasters, they'll say, why do we have it? The number one response they give is sin has entered the world and caused a repercussion of that. Some might say, because Jews did for a long time, that angels, in fact, have caused it. Fallen angels have caused it. So the two reasons they give are either human sin and or angelic sin. Okay, that's what almost everybody says. I don't find any of that compelling. I don't think sin causes earthquakes. I don't think sin causes birth defects. I don't think sin has an effect on DNA. I think we can do sinful things that will lead to doing those kinds of things. I can do all kinds of needles in my vein, or Elaine could have done all kinds of crack when she was pregnant, and it could have caused deformities. The sinful behavior of losing self-control could have had a direct impact, yes, in isolated instances. I don't think all of them are caused by sin. And I might be wrong. I'm just saying that is my view. My view is what I told you about ever since the beginning of creation. I think if we're going to blame anybody, ultimately it's not sin. I mean, God designed the system from the very beginning, and that's what happens. I think DNA doesn't always copy correctly. It doesn't always copy correctly, and it causes defects. And it's very sad, and we've had tons of friends who've been through, they've lost babies after a few months. I mean, it's horrible stuff. I don't think they sinned. I don't think the baby sinned. I don't think Adam's sin caused it. I don't think that at all. I don't find that compelling. I think DNA just didn't copy correctly. Say, well, why didn't God create a universe where the DNA copies correctly? The answer is, I don't know why, but he didn't. I know this, in the second law of thermodynamics, things do deteriorate. So we're in a system that deteriorates, and it's not going to be flawless in this world. It's just not going to. Nothing is. That's why it rusts. That's why things deteriorate over time, including the copying of DNA inside the birthing process.
So you don't think God created perfect?
That's, well, perfect. Perfect as in...
Perfect, and then the sin entered in.
I don't think
you don't believe that?
The perfect, that word makes me nervous. I think he created, it was good. God's perfect.
Perfect.
God's morally, by perfect you mean, typically perfect means, I know we're off topic, we're going to just talk, y'all leave whenever you want to leave. Perfect means, if you mean it in the sense of moral perfection, he does not nor can he sin. In that sense, no creation is not perfect because there's always the capacity to do it. Because humans have the free will, and then when they get tempted and whatever, according to Adam and Eve's story, humans are not that way. He created the universe good. Genesis says it was good. And I take John Walton's approach, who's a great Old Testament scholar. Great. He says good there, in the ancient context, means it functions properly. I do think he created the universe good, functions just the way he designed it. So if you use perfect that way, I'm fine with that. Adam and Eve were not created perfect. They didn't, did they ever stumble over a stick? Did they ever accidentally say the wrong word? I meant to say dog. So what Christian theologians have said for centuries is they were created innocently. They were in an innocent state, not perfect. And that's why these words make me a little nervous. So I do think they're innocent. I think they were innocent. I think in that sense then they sinned. I think no human is innocent. I think all humans sin. Then the different issue is why do we sin, which I'd be happy someone to talk about that if you want to. But that's a different issue as well. So did I answer your question? So I think the universe is created exactly how God wanted it to be created.
So
And he created it with the second law of thermodynamics.
So in Genesis, when it's talking about part of the curse was the thistles and the thorns come up.
Right, for men when they farm.
Okay.
That's right. So part of the problem is now he's kicked out of the garden because outside of the garden, out there in the quote-unquote wilderness, you got to deal with that. Had you stayed here with me in my garden, you wouldn't have been exposed to those things.
What about the restoration of all things?
The restoration of all things.
Yeah.
Say more for me.
Lots of, new heaven, new earth.
Revelation 21:1. Yeah, and that's also in Isaiah 65:1. Yeah, so Revelation 21:1, when it says there'll be new heavens and new earth, he says, and I saw new heavens and new earth. That's exactly right. But there, it is a new heavens and new earth. We get something brand new. Physically, a brand new physical, you might say, universe of some sort. That's exactly right.
So it's what he could have created before, but he chose not to.
That's the assumption of Christian theologians forever. That is, he certainly could have done it. In that universe, there will be no evil, no temptation, and no fallen state. That's the idea, that's right. So the issue is, now the question is, here's the real kicker. Could God have created that universe first and have the beings in that universe, would we have existed? And the typical answer is no. No, we would not have. And that's a big deal to understand, that it seems the playground we're in, as it were, seems to be designed such that we genuinely have the capacity to say no to him or say yes to him. And on top of that, we've got an evil force that also wants to tempt us. But in the world to come, while we will have free will, we will have an experience of a relationship with him such that, I'm convinced, and I think the biblical picture paints this, that we will have an experience of him where we will lose the desire to want to sin. William Lane Craig says it this way. Right now we have epistemic distance. Epistemic from episteme for Greek mean knowledge. We have a distance in knowledge. We're removed a little bit. We don't know him that well. Now, Craig says, why is that? I think he's exactly right. The distance is so that we do have more of a, freedom's the right word. We're not overpowered by his presence. C.S. Lewis says he can only woo, not cajole. He can't force us, he can woo us. But it has to be a slight wooing. As Lewis says, for only the slightest hint of his presence would overwhelm us. The slightest hint of it. In the slightest drop of a great worship service, the slightest drop, revival breaks out. People fall on their faces and weeping, and sin is confessed, and there's revival, and the great awakenings happening. The slightest sense of his presence. And in that world to come, we'll be fully in his presence. Well, David doesn't. We have free will. We will just not want anything else. We will want to have our free will exposed and love in a relationship with him that we've never experienced here. Paul says it this way: we see now in a glass dimly, but there we will see what? Face to face. And that's on purpose. If we were created right off the bat face to face, then it seems to be the case that we would not be able for him to see if we genuinely really love him. Now, the question is, you're going to ask next, but David, what about angels who fell? Weren't angels created before them and so forth? The Bible doesn't say much about that. The assumption is they also had free will, but he gave them enough, apparently epistemic distance, or enough of them to do what they want to. But in the biblical picture, we won't have that. In Revelation 21, I mean, he says he sees the city of God coming down, the New Jerusalem, and they were adorned as a bride. We are the city. We don't walk on golden streets. We are the golden streets. It's a metaphor and a metaphor. So there's no temple in the new world. Every Jew said the temple that was destroyed is hidden in the heavens. A new pristine one, it's going to be coming down the end days. And then John says, no, you are. You're it. There's no temple because you will live in the Holy of Holies all the time. So that's a big difference.
And you'll be right with God.
Right with God all the time.
I want a mansion.
I want a mansion. Good, brother. And maybe we have them. I just don't think John ever said that or Jesus ever said that. But maybe we do. Maybe we do.